My presentation is on Colorado's lost radium boom, early 20th century mining and processing landscapes on the Colorado Plateau and in Denver. And that last part is a landscape, sounds kind of strange, but this was given to a National Park Service historic landmark landscape symposium in 2011. Eric Twitty and I put it together from work that both of us had done. So maybe it'll be self-explanatory by the end. In 1898, Marie Curie isolated radium from Austrian pitchblende ore, and during that same year, samples of yellow ore were sent from Montrose, Colorado, to France for analysis by French chemists. The ore was identified as radioactive and containing uranium and vanadium, and the French named it carnotite after their boss, the French inspector of mines, Adolphe Carnot, who had just happened to be the brother of the assassinated French president. Research before the turn of the century indicated that radium should be used or could be used for the treatment of cancer. And from 1898 until 1916, that was its primary use and the reason it had become so valuable. The Colorado Plateau contained almost all of the uranium and vanadium resources known at that time in the US, and the portion of the plateau that contained it was this gridded half moon right here. If you can see my cursor, that's the Uravan mineral belt. And just to orient you, this is the Colorado-Utah state line. Here's Moab over here. And here's Uravan right here, which is important to our story. This is a simplified diagram showing the Uncompahgre Plateau and some of the places we're going to be talking about. Here's the town of Montrose, where that sample was sent to France. Here's the Rio Grande Southern Railroad, which was the closest railroad to the uranium belt. Here's the town of Placerville, which is actually on a road going out to the Paradox Basin. There's a place called Vanadium right here, which is significant. Town of Natarita and Uravan, and this is the Paradox Basin. And here's what the Paradox Valley looks like. It's actually a hydraulic basin, but it's a geologic anticline. It's actually a long anticline, sort of northwest southeast trending, with Dakota sandstone, Cretaceous sandstone on the top of the ridges and Jurassic Morrison formation on the slopes. And so you've got this dome that would have come across here for the anticline. And I'm standing in a part of the belt called Long Park. Well, about 1910, the Primos Chemical Company built a vanadium mill, actually, before anything uranium, at a place called Newmeyer, not far from Placerville, and they changed the name of the town to Vanadium. You have the San Miguel River and the Rio Grande Southern Railroad main line in the foreground, and you can see it was a pretty massive operation for 1910 in the uranium industry. Here's one of the Primos mines. They had three small mines that fed the vanadium mill, and you can see what a primitive operation it was for the early 1900s. These are actually candles stuck in the rock. Here's one right next to this miner. So obviously that mine's not being lit by candlelight. That's a flash. That same year in 1910, the U.S. Bureau of Mines opened a research lab, their second research lab in Denver on 16th Street, which was now the 16th Street Mall in downtown Denver. And this was the first one was in Pittsburgh, and it was for coal research. The reason for opening this one was for stimulating exploration for rare earth minerals and included radium, uranium, and vanadium, but also included some other interesting metals like thorium, tungsten, molybdenum, nickel, and manganese. And it's probably significant that only 8 years after this lab opened in Colorado, Climax Molybdenum opened their mine up on Fremont Pass. Here's the town of Yerevan in 1918. The Standard Chemical Company of Pennsylvania came out and acquired a large block of land on the San Miguel River, which is here on the side, for an experimental mill, a laboratory. They built a boarding house, and that's what I have circled in the middle of the slide there. And a small tent colony initially, and later some employee housing. And their experimental mill was successful, so they ended up building a much larger mill, and you can barely see it right here. It's called the Joe Jr. Mill. And they named the place Yerevan, which is short for, obviously, uranium and vanadium. You can see what public transportation was like in southwestern Colorado in 1912. This is the stagecoach from Placerville to Norwood that actually kept going on to Natarita and eventually to Yerevan and Bedrock, a couple of those other towns out west. And here's some mining equipment for Yerevan that has arrived on the railroad. This was a 3-foot narrow gauge railroad at Placerville. And the mill equipment is being unloaded from those railroad cars and placed on wagons for the 56-mile trip to Yerevan. So you can see it was still 19th century transportation at that time. Here's Long Park, the mill there, bagging their ore in 100-pound burlap sacks so they could ship the ore out, the milled ore, out by mule train or wagon to a processing facility. By 1918, things were beginning to get a little more modern. These are some Mack trucks pulling trailers from Yerevan to Placerville instead of having to use mules or wagons to get the bagged ore there. And Standard Chemical Company of Pennsylvania actually purchased a number of tank cars to use between Placerville and Montrose, where they could unload onto standard gauge rail to take it to Pennsylvania. And you can see on the side, Standard Chemical Company, producers of radium, uranium, and vanadium, Placerville, Colorado. And they had several of these because this one's number 7. The Bureau of Mines was getting concerned by this time that large quantities of carnotite and pitchblende, the two primary ores of uranium and radium, were being exported to European countries for the extraction of the radium. And they were concerned with this because of the discrepancy between the $80 a ton price paid for refined carnotite And the $120,000 per gram, think about that in 1913, price for radium. So in 1913, several doctors, one from New York and one from Baltimore, met with the Bureau of Mines and said they would expend $150,000 by 1916 to form a National Radium Institute to in Denver, where the Bureau of Mines lab was, to produce 7 grams. This is a quote: 7 grams of anhydrous radium bromide from any 1,000 tons of carnotite ore for medical research. So they were going to process 100,000 tons of ore to get 7.5 grams of radium. Overall, the federal government's influence, the Bureau of Mines' efforts at the lab here in Denver, and advances made by the private sector all brought slow and steady growth and built it into a small boom. This is the Radium Institute in South Denver. It was built during a big snow year, the biggest snow Denver's ever had, in December of 1913. And pay particular attention to these 2 circled buildings that were part of the Radium Institute, because we're going to see those later. This was a laboratory building with the peaked roof, and a warehouse with the gable roof. The National Radium Institute bought a number of mining properties over in the Paradox Basin from the Crucible Steel Company and worked those. And here's one of their mining engineers showing an area, a dark spot, that is actually organic material, because petrified wood and other types of organics actually preferentially absorb the uranium fluids in their pore spaces, and so it's enriched ore in these organic materials. And for that reason, the miners over there actually called it carbonite instead of carnotite. Here's NRI's Long Park Mill in 1915. You can see all the bagged ore back on the ridge behind it. A 15-ton per day mill, and the milled ore was stacked in those burlap bags. So pretty simple, very small mill initially, but then their goal was only to process 100,000 tons in 2 years, so it wasn't a major accomplishment. In 1916, the Bureau of Mines moved their research lab from downtown Denver to Golden, to the campus of the Colorado School of Mines, which to me seems like it would have been a more logical place than right in the middle of downtown Denver in the first place. But anyway, this is the 1894 engineering hall at the School of Mines. They were there from 1916 to 1920. And this was the location where the gas that was coming off of uranium and the radium processing had been called helium emanation. And this is where it was renamed radon gas. Just to show the value of some of the production during this time period, you can see how it fairly slowly ramped up from this 1906 time period all the way up to 1914, which was actually the peak for the medical uses. And then it dropped off a little bit in 1915 and 16 because America was still not involved in World War I. But by 1917 and 18, it was beginning to ramp up. And that was because the uses of radium changed from just medical uses to military uses. And they used the radium sulfide. They painted it on watch dials for the officers, on rifle sights so that you could snipe from your trenches at night, and also aircraft instruments because you didn't want to fly around in an open cockpit plane at night with a light shining on your instrument panel. So they used this radium sulfide, and the radium sulfide was painted on all these dials by young women in several different locations across the country, including Denver. There was a place in Denver on Colfax Avenue called the Cold, C-O-L-D, Light Illumination Company, because you didn't need any heat to make the light. And it was a radium dial painting facility. And in case some of you haven't read it, a book that I would highly recommend for everyone is called Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women. And it's a story of these radium dial painters and what they went through in the 1920s after they'd been painting these radium dials. It's pretty horrifying. As far as the value of this production, just to give you an idea, 1914 prices are, I'm going to give these in pounds instead of in ounces. But in 1914, gold was selling for $240 a pound. Carnotite ore was selling for $4 cents a pound. Yellow cake, the processed U3O8, was selling for $8 a pound. And radium was selling for $120,000 a gram, which is $55 million a pound in 1914 dollars. If that gives you an idea of how valuable this stuff was and why they were only looking for grams of this material. Well, all good things must come to an end, and the radium boom in Colorado busted in 1923. In 1914, a British major who was a geologist found a uranium ore in the Belgian Congo, and he was prospecting for the Belgians, but the Belgians had to keep it secret because if you remember your history in 1914, the Germans invaded Belgium. The Belgian Congo happened to be directly adjacent to what is now called Tanzania. But in 1914, Tanzania was called German East Africa. So to keep it secret, not only from the Germans who were in Belgium, but the Germans who were in East Africa, there was no word of this discovery until after the Treaty of Versailles was signed. In 1921, the discovery was revealed by the Belgians. And carnotite ore in Colorado, in the Colorado Plateau, ranges mostly from 1 to 3% U3O8 content. And 3% is relatively high in the Colorado Plateau. Congo ore was more than 25% U3O8. So the price of the radium just in a matter of months dropped by 50% in the US and continued to drop after that. And actually University of Colorado sociologist studied the Paradox Basin in 1923 and documented this flight of all these miners to other mining camps in Colorado and to Colorado towns and cities, and virtually no one was left in the Irvan mineral belt within a year. One company that I should mention at the end of the boom was called the Radium Company of Colorado, and their offices were in downtown Denver near Union Station. And they actually designed the processing plant in Belgium for the Belgian mining company, and then came back and closed their doors forever in Denver. Well, so what's left today? Uravan mineral belt was reused, obviously, for both the later vanadium boom that began in 1936 and the uranium boom that began secretly during World War II during the Manhattan Project. So a lot of the sites were just reused and obliterated because they were modernized and updated over the decades after the radium boom ended. But the Denver connection to that remained pretty much a secret for about 60 years. Uravan mineral belt today has been cleaned up by a number of agencies. After the uranium industry crashed after 3 Mile Island, most of the mines in the Uravan belt were cleaned up by the Colorado Mineland Reclamation Board. And the photo on the right shows one of these mine shafts that's been completely backfilled and actually had a big weight dropped on it to compact it even further. So there's nothing left but sand. And some others had their head frames taken down, buildings demolished. Sometimes those were done by the mining company if there still was a mining company, but most of these sites were just abandoned. So Mineland Reclamation had to clean them up. The uranium mills from the later uranium boom at Durango and Natarita and Slick Rock, and there were actually 2 at Natarita, were actually cleaned up under the Uranium Mill Tailings Remedial Action Program, a DOE program between 1980 and 89. And Neumeyer, the vanadium town site, was cleaned up by Superfund. Uravan was cleaned up under Superfund primarily because it was still operating when UMTRA went into effect. And UMTRA was the abandoned uranium mill program. Uravan would have been a new program. And so they actually, UMETCO cleaned up Uravan themselves with their own contractors under Superfund supervision by EPA. By the time I took this photograph in 1999, the only buildings left at Uravan were the 1912 boarding house in the background there and the recreation hall that was built in the 1930s that actually had originally been a livery stable. So they were still there in 1999. However, they were landmarked by the state, but landmarking doesn't mean preservation. So in 2007, UMETCO decided that these buildings were too expensive to restore, or what Natarita wanted was to move the buildings into the town of Natarita and build a historic park around them. But instead, UMETCO burned them down in February of 2007. And this slide was interesting because no one at the National Park Service symposium knew that these things had been destroyed. The State Historical Society didn't know that they had been destroyed. And that was 2011. So 4 years after they were burned down, the state didn't realize 2 of their state landmark buildings were gone. And the following week, they sent one of their historic preservation officers over there to see if I knew what I was talking about. And sure enough, they were gone. So there was a, a gasp from the audience at that conference whenever I showed this slide. So now we're only left with a few ruins of the radium boom. This is the Primos Mine tramway near Sawpit, which is near the location of the town of Vanadium and the mill. You can actually barely see some cables still strung for that tramway. On the right's the ruins of the Wedding Bell mine, and they're definitely ruins. There on the lower left, there's the adit for the Vanadate mine, which was one of the ones worked during the radium boom, and I guess prospected but never reopened during the uranium boom. And you can see some old root cellars up in Long Park. Long Park actually had a fairly good sized population living up there because it wasn't close to any towns. So the mines and mills up on top of the ridge had their own houses and corrals and root cellars and other things. So this is a couple of the remains of that. So it was lost to history from 1936 or from 1923 until 1979, when an EPA geologist out in Las Vegas named Don Hendricks had been reading a 1916 Bureau of Mines publication about the National Radium Institute. So he called the Colorado Department of Health to ask where the location was for that National Radium Institute. And interestingly, the director of the Colorado Radiation Control Division, Al Hazel, had to admit that he'd never even heard of the National Radium Institute, didn't have any idea where it was located. So Don managed to get funding for a helicopter, an airborne radiation scanner, to fly over from Las Vegas from the Nevada test site and fly a grid over the whole Denver metropolitan area. And on that aerial survey, they found 31 radium contaminated sites all over the Denver area, but primarily along railroads and along the South Platte River, because that was those were the transportation corridors at the time this radium boom occurred. So as soon as that information got out to the public, it of course hit the local newspapers and local TV stations, and people all over Denver were suddenly frightened to death because they were afraid they were glowing in the dark. So very quickly, EPA instituted the Denver Radium Site Superfund project to begin cleaning up these radium sites, including the National Radium Institute site. One of the sites they cleaned up was the Bureau of Mines Research Lab in downtown Denver. By now it was called the University Building, and they had to take all of the wooden windowsills from the 5th floor out of the building and put them in drums because apparently they opened the windows. This was an old building, and set their evaporating dishes on the windowsill to evaporate their liquids when they were trying to separate these minute quantities of radium. They also had to take all the sewer pipes from the 5th floor to the basement out and send all that material to a low-level radiation waste site out in Utah at Clive. The Bureau of Mines connection to the Colorado School of Mines wasn't really discovered for another 6 years. I guess mines was slow on the uptake. That they had been connected to this radium boom also. Their processing plant laboratories were on the top floor. Their offices were on the center floor, and all of their milling equipment was in the basement. It turned out it was somewhat radioactive, believe it or not. And since I had all my calculus classes in that building when I was going to mines, and it was now being used as the math building, I got very interested in the story. Since I had worked on the Denver Radium Superfund site, I wrote an article about the ties between the Colorado School of Mines, the Bureau of Mines, and the Colorado radium boom in the early 1900s. And it was actually published in March of 1986 in the Mines magazine. And it still took another 3 years after my article before they decontaminated the building. In the meantime, the professors had to move their offices to a different building. They couldn't be in the building all day because of the radioactivity, even after they'd been sitting in those offices, a lot of them for probably 10 or 15 or even 20 years. And students could only be in the building a maximum of 2 hours a day. The National Radium Institute was part of the Denver Radium Superfund site. And remember the two buildings I showed you in 1914? There they are. They were still there at the Robinson Brick and Tile site in 1982 when I took this photograph. Interestingly, the brick clay probably provided a really good cap for the radioactive waste at this site. The problem was that it was all the way down in the water table, and this was just across Santa Fe Drive from the South Platte River. So not exactly a good situation. So this area was decontaminated. I believe they ended up excavating something like 250,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil and shipping it off to Utah to the low-level radiation waste site. So what happened to the National Radium Institute site after it was cleaned up? Well, this big building in the background is now a Home Depot store. And I'm taking the photograph through the I-25 and Broadway light rail station that probably gets, 20 or 25,000 people a day transferring from buses to light rail cars at this particular site. So it's a very active portion of Denver now. It's nothing like it was when it was Robinson Brick and Tile. And this is the end, but I just wanted to mention that the School of Mines wasn't the only school to get involved in this radioactive program of the Bureau of Mines, because the reason that the laboratory left mines in 1920 was because the Mackey School of Mines offered to build a brand new $43,000 brick building for the Bureau of Mines Rare Earths Laboratory. So in 1920, the laboratory moved to Reno and has been there ever since. So the School of Mines in Colorado wasn't the only school of mines that was doing radioactive research very early in the 20th century, and of course being contaminated as well. And that's the end. So are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I had trouble finding my unmute.
Okay. I'll turn my video back on. Okay. How about some questions? Do we have any?
This is Johnny. I think it's interesting you recounted at least two cases when regulators or bureaucrats had no clue what was going on regarding something that they were kind of supposed to be aware of and responsible for.
That's
It's not
correct.
unheard of. It's more common you think, but it's like, okay, something burns down they don't know about for 4 years. I mean, and then never heard of something that's, it's like everybody else knows, but not the ones who supposed to know.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and if Don Hendricks hadn't just happened to be flipping through an old Bureau of Mines publication, we might still not know.
Yeah, Steve, that was really an excellent talk. I mean, I remember many of those sites from the uranium belt tour that Rudy Davison organized for the Telluride meeting.
Right.
And I was working for the Bureau in Washington, D.C. when all this was going on. And it was interesting that in the end, I don't know how many other PRPs there were responsible parties, but the Bureau of Mines was named the PRP for this site.
Yep.
And so for the next several years, we had to convince Congress that we needed money to pay the EPA for the Superfund cleanup in Denver and all points. And of course, I guess uranium mill tailings was all over the Denver area, as you pointed out with the aerial surveys that were done. But I know they hauled. We did finally get money put into the Bureau of Mines budget to pass through to EPA to haul the stuff, the radioactive material, and it turned out to be a mixed waste, not just radioactive.
Exactly.
And it all got hauled in railroad cars over to the desert in Utah.
Yep.
And I don't remember how many millions of dollars. It was a very substantial piece of the Bureau's budget for a couple of years, and we just passed it through to the EPA. The booklet or the Bureau of Mines bulletin that was talked about the Radium Institute was one of those very, very early, even before they had ICs and RIs. And the pictures of it were tremendous because I can remember seeing benches with these dishes of solutions being evaporated to get the radium salts.
Yep.
It was quite a project. Certainly something new for the Bureau of Mines in the 1980s and 90s, because all of a sudden we began to worry that with all the various research that was done for probably 75 or 80 years by the Bureau on all kinds of strange low-grade mineral resources, we began to wonder if we were going to get nailed for some of the Superfund liability in places like Butte and where else. And I guess they found deeper pockets or different pockets for some of those sites. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. The government suing the government.
Yeah. You're lucky you didn't get involved in Butte.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We'd still be there.
Yep.
Maybe the Bureau of Mines would still be alive.
Maybe that's why you're not alive.
Well, there was just an article, and I don't know whether it was in the Wall Street Journal or something else the other day about how the government laboratories of the World War II area in the 50s, were certainly not the most concerned about pollution and waste material of all sorts. I remember when the Bureau of Mines closed, they had a huge DOE-funded cleanup at the Albany, Oregon Research Lab of the Bureau of Mines, which, amongst other things, developed the processes for titanium. In fact, they had a full-scale production facility there that built the titanium they needed for the first Nautilus submarine, and in the end, that was all funded by the military. And in the end, it was all dumped in the back 40, all the waste material. So it became a huge cleanup process there. most of the Bureau of Mines research centers didn't have that waste problem, but a couple of them did.
Yeah.
Jack,
Much
you
of
had your hand
the
up?
much of the uranium used in the World War II atom bombs came from the Belgian Congo.
Yep.
And I remember when I was working in the gas hills in uranium in the mid 60s, that the AEC was buying uranium U3O8 at $8 a pound.
Yep. Yeah, that one of the interesting stories about the use of that Congo ore for the Manhattan Project was that the Belgians, just before the Germans invaded, sent a shipment of ore to the United States instead of to Belgium because they feared for having it fall into the wrong hands. And it was unloaded onto a dock in New Jersey, and it sat there for a while in a warehouse, uh, meanwhile contaminating the concrete floor of the warehouse because it was such high grade ore that it impacted everything around it. And the ore still had such high radiation content after they processed it for the atomic bombs that they put the residues into silos in Buffalo, New York, and kept them there for a number of years because they thought they had a potential for being reused.
Well, what's interesting, there was about 1,200 tons, I believe, of that ore that was brought in. I had a chance, it was 60 years ago, to go underground at Charlie Steen's Mi Vida mine in near Moab.
Yep. Yeah, they ended up building a big mill at Moab because of Charlie Steen.
That's right. Well, Big Atlas Mill. It's still a super fun site.
Yep, they're still cleaning it up.
Now I've been to Moab several times over the years, and they're still working there.
Yeah, they were the last time I was there, and that was just a year ago.
No, I worked about 6 months at the Lucky Mac uranium mine that Utah Mining and Construction had in the Gas Hills.
Jane, did you have a question?
One thing I noticed is kind of odd, that $8 a pound for uranium. Seems that was the number that Westinghouse agreed to supply fuel for their reactors, but got them in a whole heap of trouble back during the last uranium boom.
That's a pretty low price.
Yeah,
Well-
but they had their feet put to the fire, and
Yeah,
interesting history on that.
A bit of a story about Utah Mining and Construction then is their shippable cost for U3O8 was less than $3 a pound. So the chairman of the board, depending on what he wanted to do with the EPA, with earnings per share for that particular quarter, would determine how many pounds were shipped to the AEC.
Yeah, so I was just wondering if you knew anything about what were called radium health institutes back in the early 1900s. Like, what were the claims there? And I assume they were probably having pretty low levels of radium in there.
yes, they used primarily radium bromide, and they put it in tiny little sealed glass ampules, and they would actually, in some cases, make an incision and insert that ampule in the incision and stitch it back up and leave it for a certain period of time to try to reduce the size of the tumor. So it would be like getting radiation treatment today, but much more primitive, I guess, for that time period. But that was what these doctors were after. The 7.5 grams would actually be broken down into milligram, increments for these little ampules that they were using. So they could make a lot of, or they could treat a lot of patients with just that very, very small amount of radium. Later, of course, radium sulfide was what was used to paint the watch dials and instrument dials. But after the health scares of the 1920s, they substituted thorium sulfide on things like watch dials for the luminescent watch dials like we had when we were kids, or at least I had one when I was a kid. But my parents wouldn't buy me a Mickey Mouse watch. I had a Hopalong Cassidy watch instead, which probably nobody younger than 70 remembers Hopalong Cassidy. But anyway, that's what I had. And the interesting thing was that they were still radioactive enough that one of the things we learned in Cub Scouts was to put a sheet of unexposed film in a manila envelope in a dark room. And then you would, at night, you would put the envelope on your end table, and you would put a key on top of it. And then you would turn your watch upside down with the watch face on the top of the key, and leave it overnight. And the next day you could develop that unexposed film, and you would have an X-ray of a key on your film. So it was still somewhat radioactive, and we were walking around, as 9 or 10-year-old kids with these things on our wrist.
I was also wondering what's involved in a cleanup, and where is this place in Utah where
It's called,
contaminant was?
it's at a location called Clive, and it's a low-level radioactive waste disposal site. It's a commercial site. So it operates to take low levels of and they do have a laboratory, and they test things to make sure they don't get anything high level. It has to meet certain standards, and then they can dispose of it in clay-lined pits that they've excavated. And it's been in operation now for, I guess, about over 40 years.
Mhm.
And as far as I know, it's still open. It's
Oh,
out
that's right.
out near the Bonneville Salt Flats.
Yeah, Steve, the thing that, as I recall, the thing that complicated that disposal project was that as they started excavating stuff at the brickyard, they found out the site had previously had smelting activities from some of the metal producers, and I don't know whether there were other places. There obviously were other smelters around Denver. And so that immediately pitched it into the mixed waste category,
Yeah.
which was another level of cost and complications of disposal.
Yeah, because all those smelter sites had lead contamination
Sure.
because they were silver, lead, zinc smelters.
Yeah, right.
And there weren't a lot of other smelter buildings left in Denver at that time. I mean, there were a couple of operating smelters, of course,
Yeah.
but one of the processing plants was in a cotton cotton cloth manufacturing plant. One of them was in an old brewery, and it became a radium processing plant, up until the end of the radium boom. And a lot of the locations were like that. There was one location where it was in an old single-story brick building next to the railroad track, and apparently they would just pitch all their waste out the window onto the railroad grade. And so they had to dig up part of the railroad grade because it was contaminated. And then a lot of the waste on these sites was just dumped into a landfill. And there was or an old gravel pit. It would be even better in their eyes for doing that.
Sure.
And so the city of Denver Street Department excavated an old gravel pit and used the material from it as aggregate for asphalt to pave a whole bunch of streets right around the Denver Botanical Gardens and City Park and Congress Park over in East Denver. So there are neighborhoods over there where you have to have a special permit to excavate a trench through the asphalt because the asphalt is radioactive and has to be disposed of over at Clive. And the reason they didn't just excavate the whole street and take it all off is because apparently the asphalt that was put down that was contaminated was done in 1953. And so imagine how many layers of asphalt it's got on top of it now. So it was just too expensive to take it all up. So they just left it, and you have to have these, it's a red flagged area, and you have to get permission from the city to excavate those areas.
Mike Nelson, did you want to say something? You had your hand up for a while.
Just all this talk of uranium reminded me of when I was teaching at the University of Utah. A retired man would come in. His name was Ralph Hafen, and he was part of the Hafen family that settled in southwestern Utah. I think his brother was the Colorado State historian, but he had gone to law school, and then he graduated from law school and started working for the Atomic Energy Commission. And then he realized that he could make a lot more money if he became a prospector. This would have been in 1952 or 3. But all you had to do was go and take your Geiger counter and find a place where it clicked real loud, gather up a bucket full of that ore and take it to the AEC in Grand Junction, and they'd look at it and put their Geiger counter on it and give you a check for $20,000 to start mining. His claims were up on the San Rafael Swell, just a beautiful spot, and he had a landing strip up there and everything.
Was it
I got to
mine?
know him because by the time I was at the U, he was late 70s, and in Utah, if you're a senior citizen, you can audit any class if the roll isn't full. So he had audited all the geology classes and all mining engineering classes at least twice.
Did he
Just
actually
interesting.
mine it?
Yeah, he did. They mined it and shipped it out. There were, I guess there were 3 or 4 entries there going into the cliff face. You know, they caved in.
Yeah. Which part of the swell was it in? Was it north of I-70 or south?
As I recall, it was north of I-70.
Okay.
Anyway, just,
Easy area to get
Interesting.
lost in.
yeah. So thanks for your presentation. I enjoyed that.
Good. Thank you.
Very good.